Let's get started then. Hello, Vitaly. Hello, Pavel. Today, we are going to talk about the war. And we will try to talk about it not in the genre of mass media, but in the genre of philosophy. The reason for it was your very interesting article on a leader, which I recommend to all listeners to watch before watching this video. Well, I have a number of questions for her, respectively. More precisely, a few to it. How many to a number of its parts, to a number of its theses, which it seems to me, it would be useful for us all to discuss, in order to dot the I. I frankly think that we are going to restore and install the format as we go along, so let's see what will come of it. It seems to me that it is just that. In other words, my main, in fact, comments and questions are to the first, this paragraph of your text. Because I think there are certain contradictions there. Here you write about the fact that society, brought up on late Soviet pacifism in the struggle for peace, is accustomed to the regularity and ordinariness of war. It seems to me that this thesis, is directly wrong. It seems to me that the reality of war has disappeared from the consciousness of society after the 70s. And it was a common vector. For me, it is very important both in the USSR and in the USA. It is gone. That is, I repeat, I just share the consciousness of war and the consciousness of a special operation. These are two qualitatively different phenomena. Therefore, when you write that society lives in the habit of war, for me this is just, frankly speaking, erroneous, because it is precisely the understanding of war as a certain part of the historical process in modern society, since the 70s, that has consistently disappeared. We just don't observe it. It becomes either a cultural artifact or a symbol, but somehow somewhere very far away, and somewhere not about us. The very idea of another mass conflict is blocked at the level of reflection, at the level of language, at the level of vocabulary, and this in many ways creates, in my opinion, what you write about in the future. This is the state of permanent hypocrisy. Your texts are also very important and vital to me, because since we have been living in a new reality, which began after the so-called special operation, we are, I think intensely, trying to understand what exactly is happening, not in the sense of war as such, but in the sense of modern war, how it differs from what happened and how. Here is our generation, in general, my generation. I found the Soviet Union already quite ending, and we were ironic over the rhyme tractor in the field of holes. We are for mere, but we lived in full clear awareness the immutability of peace and such immutability of fears of a big war at least.
В полном и ясном осознании неизменности мира и такого неизменности опасений большой войны, по крайней мере.
There was an Afghan war, of course, but it was quite intensively discussed, but nevertheless, there was no war. And of course, I agree that, in a sense, it does not exist now. But I was nevertheless surprised by how quickly public communications about the war are changing. I remember when it was just beginning, it wasn't even this part of the war that Russia started, but the part of the war that began, as if spontaneously after the Maidan, so in the 14th year. There I think at what point the viewers of the then Ukrainian television, now Russian, I wondered how, being absolute people who hate war, and hate war by speech. Many soldiers hate the war, with whom I talked. At the same time, they hide its reality from themselves in an amazing way. For example, there is a plot going on. Our tanks and artillery are obviously bombing somewhere. After that, it is easily reported that, of course, the opponents themselves fired at themselves, and the terrorists did something terrible to the civilian population, and where the tanks fired at is not clear at all. I think that at the moment when these tanks of ours are connected and the mountain is there will be some kind of reaction. Don't connect. She came. Don't connect because it's different. It's all about different things. In other words, you have swept away a lot of phenomenon. The first phenomenon. I'm sorry if I'm speaking with a little bit of a lecturing tone, a little bit of professional information, so if anything, please like this, sort of correct it. Look, the first one. This is a problem. This is what Madriar, Virilio, all these theorists of modern war write about. The problem is that the war is becoming remote. This is a new reality that has just begun for us. Then it will get worse. Then there will be drones. The mass use of drones, which will further establish this gap. You see, up to the First World War, in fact. In other words, this milestone is happening at the level of the First World War. The main means of defeating the enemy was in the field of your visual visibility. That is, you pulled the trigger, or even more so, lowered the arrow, you took the sword, and you saw. There was, well, a direct correlation between action and non-action. The change in the appearance of long-range artillery has qualitatively changed this general pattern. That is, as if the war became remote. The appearance of missiles, the appearance of laser-guided heads when you shoot 300 kilometers away. Well, relatively speaking, the pilot launched a rocket. It hit the house after 400 kilometers and folded it there. He does not feel any emotion towards this is connected. Again, this is a universal problem right away. Come on, here I am, me for me. Perhaps a special case is more important to you. It is more important for me to show that this particular case is just a particular case from a more general problem, because, in fact, it was the philosophers who began to write about it first, back in these clashes with this new military reality. The fact that there is a gap between the action and the consequence of this action, and it is irreversible. You will take everyone in chain mail, with swords, you will not give out swords. You will not send them to the battlefield. The war will become more and more a remote war. In remote warfare, you don't feel emotionally attached. I have, excuse me, my own personal experiences of communicating with soldiers, just says, and I. And what? The gunner? Well, for justice on the Ukrainian side. Well, I think that the Russian side has exactly the same experience. I'm artist, that I went, but I turned around and came back. In other words, a person has no emotional feeling. That is, because it is not in the experience. In other words, it is very important, phenomenologically, this is not present in the experience. That is, no matter how you do your job, it is no different from working in a factory. Again, from the point of view of experience. This is one part, if you please, of the process. The second thing you talked about is the notorious reaction of society to these processes. And here it is, of course, about something completely different. It lies in the fact that we lived in certain illusions that, first of all, a certain sense of collectivity is not important for people, and people are ready to hand it over calmly, in exchange, let's say, for a certain universal framework of cosmopolitanism. I'm sorry, I can't think of any other words. That is as it were. And it turned out that people really care. It really matters to people what language their children will learn. It really matters to people what kind of stories they will have at school about who is a hero and who is a traitor, who is good, who is bad. This is all what I call an ethos, all that I call a collective personality. And what you have seen is actually natural historical processes. The fact that when the collective personality is under threat, people begin to get involved in it out of hand. And this is not just propaganda. This is the action of very deep archetypes. This is the action of deep collective psychology. And in fact, these are health indications. In other words, this is also a big problem, because if you are not ready to turn on when your collective identity becomes threatened, then your collective identity will die. That is, people will remain, but the collectivity will die. You can make the argument, well, it would be nice if this collective personality manifested itself in some other way, yes. But it's difficult, because here you are, in fact, saying, let's have the whole story like this, and we will come out from our generation in a different way. There is a certain good youthful enthusiasm in this, but so far it is difficult to imagine exactly how this can happen. I want to remind you here, you know what? The song of Vladimir Vysotsky, In the Fields of a Diffused Mind. You probably remember her, right? More precisely, the hall of some guns has long been silent. There's only sunlight above us. What are people tested on, if there is no war anymore? One often hears now, how then would you go scouting with him? No or yes. It's really about that. The fact that the problem of manifestation and verification, if you like, is this of your collective beginning, and the war is. And in this sense, Heraclitus was right when he said that war is the father of all things. That is, it was true in the time of Heraclitus, and it is true today. Modern war is different in that it all happens in spite of. Because the modern state would really like to fight without fighting. And here it seems to me, in fact, the main contradiction is that from the point of view of the state, it would prefer that there was no battle, and there were only special operations. And society is right, in fact, acts as a healthier actor, considering a special operation a greater hypocrisy than war.
Мгм.
I
Я
thank you very
по
much
мотивам
for
большое
this
тебе за
wonderful
это,
fixation.
прекрасную фиксацию.
I would
Я бы
like to
хотел
go a
задать
little
немножко
further
дальше, может быть,
and maybe ask or
спросить и
even
даже
confirm
подтвердить
some paradoxes that
некоторые,
concern me.
некоторые волнующие меня парадоксы. А, а,
That's what
вот
you say,
в
the
том, что вы
state and
говорите
society
государство
seem
это не
amazing, but
общество,
also rational players.
кажется
There are state agents, for
удивительным,
example,
но
economic state agents.
иррациональные
They
игроки,
often behave irrationally just because they are also captured
государственные
by
агенты,
the ethos of the mass
добрые,
emotions of the sacred.
экономические государственные агенты, они часто ведут себя иррационально как раз потому, что тоже захвачены этосом, массовой эмоцией, священной массовой эмоцией.
It's not an emotion after all.
Мгм.
Emotion, remember this,
Да, да,
moral
моральным
feelings.
чувством,
Yes,
моральным,
collective moral
коллективным моральным
feelings.
чувством.
And this
И
leads,
это
perhaps, to some errors of
приводит,
rationality, including
возможно,
among
к
these
некоторым
agents,
ошибкам
not
рациональности,
only among
которые
us
происходить не
ordinary
только у
people
нас,
who are trying to
потому что
self-define
мы можем
themselves
быть в
in a
сложной ситуации,
difficult situation, when,
когда
in general, for
войны,
example, when
например, когда
people are
войны
fighting very
полгода
similar
идти,
and who could
которые
not think of each
наносят
other's
многие
wars.
войны друга. А,
And it is
И
clear that we
понятно, что
understand that there is a
понимая,
great
что есть
historical
большой
process,
исторический
as if
процесс, как
natural
бы
to the
естественный
self-defense of
для
ethical, large
самозащиты
ethical cultural communities
больших
at the
политических
moment of
культурных
threat.
сообществ в момент угрозы.
But
Но
there is also a tactical thing.
вещь и
There is something that
тактическая,
feels like a
вещь тоже
threat,
ощущается
but
как
at the
угроза,
same time,
но
it
при
is
этом
taken as concrete,
принимаются
rational,
конкретные
irrational
рациональные
decisions.
иррациональные решения.
And it
И
seems,
кажется,
and it
и
seems
кажется,
that the
что
field of
область
rationality is floating
рациональности
a lot because,
сильно плывет, потому что
of course, she's swimming, but she can't help but swim. In other words, I'm sorry to turn on, but I think I understand the question. But we are not a coma economy. That's the point. That is, if we look at a whole person and not at a purely comatose person, then what happens here is that you are happening. Rationality. This is only one-third of our behavior. Well, as I understand it for myself, she influences, she makes a decision, but she is far from the only one, and that's why it happens that you happen. This again, it seems to me, is a certain legacy of such technological optimism, including in the anti-late 19th, early 20th centuries, especially, that is, on the creation of a rational person, what a person is, a rational being. But you are absolutely right. Moreover, I know this again on anecdotal levels too. In other words, I have communicated with such consistent liberals. Well, consistent. And they sincerely do not understand how their child's language of instruction can be valuable for someone. That is, it doesn't translate into numbers in any way. That is, as it were. Well, as a rule, they were very rich people. Well, how would it turn out? Yes, that is. There is a correlation between income level and worldview, let's say, a certain one. But yes, that is, there are people for whom it is sincerely unclear how people can act irrationally. Well, here we are not going to reveal any secrets. Behavioral economics tells us that, even in economics, people act irrationally in many ways. That is, not in accordance with the expectations of this ideal market theory. Therefore, at the level of society, it happens exactly the same way. In other words, rationality occupies a certain niche, and, in my opinion, it is, of course, official. In fact, rationality for a person is always useful for an ethical task or for an emotional task, but it does not lead to rationality. She's not some kind of. This is not the driver of our chariot. It's still a tool that we use to realize a certain ideal. I would say so. But this is it. This is my philosophical position. It is controversial. Nevertheless, well, since we are communicating with you, I will risk presenting it, as it were. I think I share it. There's just this. Where would I like to move from this now? There is a millennium of thinking about war and attempts to tame it in one way or another. I absolutely agree. And here it is interesting how we felt in this place, where it seems as if these thousands of years have not been. And my opinion, thank God if not. If we turn off the emotion with an effort of will, we will say that everything is not so bad, but at the millennial level. That is, in fact, it is not really necessary to sprinkle ashes on your head at all. But let's fix the fundamental problem. My thesis sounds paradoxical. I came out on it myself relatively recently, so it's quite raw, but I don't have a better one. It is the closing of the eye, the vowel phenomenon of war, that makes it such, that it deliberately zeroes out the entire historical experience of its civilization. In other words, as soon as we tell ourselves that there are no wars, but only special operations, wars become more inhumane than they would be if we consciously recognized their necessity as part of international relations. They fell into emotional cries about volumes. How is the war? Well, this is a paradox. He may not be very pleasant, again from an emotional point of view. I wasn't unpleasant, I can share it, but I don't have a better one. In other words, the problem is that if we don't see something, we can't interact with it. That is, if we deny the existence of something, if we have translated it into the category of abnormality, even before the discussion, then, accordingly, we are doomed to do it as much as possible. Well, crooked, let's call it that, as contradictory as possible. But again, hypocrisy is a gap between word and deed. So we get the same thing. We say one thing, we do another, and again on a collective level. Again, but very importantly, you need to understand. Let's say, well, the audience is Russian. I will explain. It was not Russia that came up with the report to consolidate the protection. Russia did not come up with the concept of humanitarian intervention. She uses it, but she didn't invent it. In other words, it was a common problem. I repeat, the key event is the trauma of the Second World War. It was such a traumatic event that people decided that there would be no more wars. But they are unable to change human nature, so the wars continued. They simply ceased to be called such. And in the end, in my opinion, it created the worst system of international relations in terms of, well, let's say, as a system of relationships. I am referring to humanitarian law. I am referring to the right to wage war. I am referring to the expectations of, let's say, the participants in general. In other words, the paradox is that in order to make the war more civilized in quotation marks, it needs to be returned to its rightful place. That's my answer.